We are pleased to kick off our afternoon with two amazing speakers who I will have the pleasure of introducing. But before I get into their introductions, I just want to quickly go through our agenda one more time for the afternoon. So we will be kicking it off with the Blinc Group and in collaboration with Via Innovations. We'll be finishing the afternoon with a presentation from RioSense. And if you would like to connect with us, we do encourage you to follow us on LinkedIn, Twitter, or Facebook. We would love to connect with you. If you have questions after the summit ends, please feel free to connect with us, and we are happy to connect you with our presenters or answer any questions we can directly. We also encourage you to ask your questions throughout the presentations. Our presenters have set aside Q&A time at the end of their presentation. And so we want you to go ahead and ask those questions. And then at the end, we will host the Q&A. And one last reminder before I get to introduce these next wonderful speakers is we are recording these sessions and the recordings will be sent out after. So if you feel you missed anything, fear not. There will be recordings of our sessions. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our next speakers. We have Arnaud Dumas de Rauly. He is the CEO of the Blinc Group and chair of ISO and CEN vaping standards and committees, as well as Monica Vialpando, PhD, who is the founder and CEO of Via Innovations. Today, they will be sharing with us pairing the right cannabis vaping hardware with the right concentrate. And without further ado, it's my pleasure to turn it over to Arnaud and Monica.
Right. Thank you very much. I will try to see if screen share works. I've never actually done it on GoToWebinar. File, okay. Here comes the tricky part. Apparently I cannot present my screen. I have to go get the file from Dropbox, Google Drive. I'm really sorry about this. It's the whiteboard option.
There should be a sharing tab right in the...
Yeah, there is, but I can't share my... Oh, are you seeing my screen right now?
It looks like it's loading.
All right, you should see the title slide.
It wants to show us, but I am seeing a white blank screen.
Okay. I don't know what to do here.
Are you in PowerPoint?
Yeah, I am. I'm trying to present content, and I can't share my screen. I have to go log into a Dropbox or anywhere. Oh.
I do have your...
If you put it on me, I can do it on the computer. If you have the presentation loaded too, I can perhaps drive it on through my end.
Let me try. Monica, I'm going to try to give it to you and see if it will let you present.
Okay. Change. Okay.
And if not, I'm happy to drive the presentation portion for you both.
I think I'm also having some difficulties for some reason. If you don't mind, we can the click. So very interactive. So, okay, cool.
Are you all seeing my screen now?
Yes.
Yeah. Yep.
Perfect. Just let me know.
Well, thank you very much.
I'll drive for you.
And we're really sorry, everyone, about this fumbling. So just by brief background, Monica and I have worked together previously in the nicotine vaping industry, and have recently done some work together now on the cannabis vaping industry. And with that said, hand it off to you, Monica.
Sounds good. Thank you, Arnaud. Like I said, V Innovations and the Blinc Group have been collaborating for quite some time now. My background comes from pharmaceutical sciences and drug product formulation. During that experience, I was exposed to inhalation drug products around dry powder inhalers, nebulizers, meter dose inhalers. And so as the nicotine space was evolving around the electronic cigarette industry in Europe around 2014, when we first met, 15, that's when I decided to apply my drug development knowledge on inhalation to vaping products. And so that ran parallel with the cannabis industry. And you'll see some of those numbers and the prevalence with vaping as I move forward with the coming slides. So here's a little bit of a synapse of lessons learned in this area. So if you don't mind putting the next slide on. So when I joined the cannabis industry, at the time it was primarily flower, oil-based formulations, and of course vapes were starting to take and evolve. Where we're seeing as markets are opening, different regulations around adult use and medical, we're seeing a little bit more product differentiation around technologies, but really the inhalation side of drug delivery with cannabis remains very much at the forefront, where those categories 1, 3, and 1 and 3 are really dominating a big portion of the field. So as these products expand, it's really important to create well-designed products, especially as the market becomes more and more saturated as a means to differentiate and outperform the next guy. Next slide, please. And so I gave you a little bit of insight of previews to come. And so if you look here at the sales data from last year, on the top there, you can see the concentrates are ranking about the high percent, but really the vape category, the cartridges and the extracts on the purple on the top there, you can see they're taking a big portion of the market. Topicals are slowly growing, but no, sorry, the flower market is, so really the biggest contributors in the sales data are all around inhalation, and these vape products and concentrates are taking a major stakehold in that, especially as the technology develops.
Monica, if you don't mind, I just want to add that this is 2020 data. We don't have the full year of data on 2021, but that amount is growing now even more in 2021, and we're almost at 35% of cartridges and almost at 16% of concentrates. So together, that's almost 50% of the entire cannabis market, because of course concentrates can be vaped.
Yeah, exactly. No, thanks for that clarification. And yeah, 100%. It is only growing more in category, especially as new states come on the market, whether entering just the medical or the adult use category. So this will grow along with the trend with the regulations, without a doubt. Next slide, please. Thank you. So one of the biggest surprises for me when I entered the cannabis space from pharma was exactly how complex the cannabis plant is. Oftentimes, depending on how we extract the plant, we're left with a lot of byproducts, which are positive byproducts depending on the efficacy that you're going for. You can see we have over 140 terpenes in the cannabis plant. Cannabinoids in the cannabis plant, plethora of terpenes, and we're just growing as scientists are able to uncover and all of these components influence viscosity and the performance of the finished product. Next slide, please. And so I briefly mentioned, depending on the extract type, it will yield very different forms. And these all have different considerations when designing your product, especially around the compatibility of your extract together with the vape pen. The industry has a range of purities, and I've listed out from the wide range of extracts available in the cannabis industry. These are really the main 4 that are incorporated into vape products. In Europe, we're seeing a lot of isolates being incorporated on that side. On the US market, and definitely where I work primarily in California, most of them are comprised of distillate. But there is definitely a trend going towards a more full and whole spectrum approach and extract for vaping. The reasons is you are capturing some more of the flavors of the plant, and it's more of the full spectrum profile. Kind of the experience is lies to the combustion of cannabis flower. And so as Arnaud was saying earlier, your concentrates, where they fall in a slightly different category than vapes, are actually starting to merge, where these concentrates are being used in vape pens. Next slide, please. And so with this diversity, you could already see visually many differences. So I'll highlight viscosity, as this is a key highlight of this conference, but also from a wider product development landscape, these also affect the solubility of it, the bioavailability, and how well it is taken up in the body, as well as how stable it is in your vape pen, depending on the cannabinoid type, and then for other properties if you wanted to take it to another dosage form. If you could click that slide. So in focusing on viscosity here, what we're talking about, we're seeing vast differences around cannabinoid types, whether that's meaning THC or CBD, and I'll show you data in the coming slides, as well as the ratios. Many brands like to differentiate and tailor different effects based on the ratios provided. The purity also plays a role. So based on the previous slide, for example, the distillate being a higher pure versus the full spectrum slightly lower purity. So all of that has a major influence to consider. The extraction form, as well as the terpene concentration. This is an interesting to point out, in that oftentimes terpenes are added to vape pens to dilute down and decrease the viscosity, so that the extract and the device work together in a more compatible way, as well as for that same reason, and another diluent type, and of course the extended concentration, which is used in that formulation. So moving on to the data on the next slide, here's an example. This is taken on the same instrument, looking here at the viscosity of a pure THC distillate. This was from the same lab, same analyst. You can see a major difference based on the purity of THC. So the other plant material that's not necessarily extensively characterized is having a big influence on that performance. So when thinking about this pairing decision, it's also being mindful of what purity ranges you're working with, and also how consistent your incoming material is going to be, because that will affect the batch-to-batch consistency of your final product. And if you go over and let's click on the next section, you see here on the right, so I basically took the 3 THC values on the left and transferred them over to the right, and I also incorporated other cannabinoids. We're looking at delta 8 THC, THCA, so the acidic version of THC and CBD. And you can see, and so if you don't mind clicking one more time, please. These also vary in purity ranges too. So not only within the purity of one cannabinoid, but also the same purity of different cannabinoids play a significant role in that. And especially one thing I want to point out is around the delta 8 THC, that actually had to be heated slightly in order to get it to work in the instrument. It was too viscous to perform. So this is definitely a area of research that the innovations and Blinc Group have been focusing on to help our customers better predict the performance when incorporating certain types in it. And it's based on really getting and understanding the formulation features around the extract and their profiles. Next slide, please. And so if you think about all of these different extract types, now adding here the illustration of all the different hardware types. So we really, we're seeing more and more attention being placed onto the compatibility of both the formulation and the device, especially as these technologies grow and evolve and there's new players going onto the market. So I will hand it over to the guy that knows more about devices than anyone else I know. So Arnaud, without further ado, if you want to hand this over.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Monica. I think starting with this slide is actually perfect because, as you said, it really shows the diversity of different types of hardware that we have. So if you really look on for definition purposes, on the left side, you have the cartridges. Right next to that, you have different types of batteries. So there's puff activated batteries, there's button activated batteries that all heat at different temperatures, which we'll dive a little bit deeper into later. The third type is what we call the disposables or the all-in-ones. And on the right, you have the pod systems. So this is, again, it's just an idea, but there are millions of other form factors that can be used in vaping devices. Now, the purity and the cannabinoids are two major components that have impact on the viscosity. But there is also another one that happens in use. It's the temperature of the products. Can you go to the next slide, please? Thank you very much. The temperature, when you think of it, and the initial thought is they're only being used, and that temperature only comes into play when people are using the device. But that's actually not true, because the temperature and any other environmental factors come to play at 4 different areas during the entire production value chain. So when you're producing vaping devices, you receive the devices themselves. When you're a producer, you need to fill them. Now, this step is either done manually with syringes or semi-automatically or even completely automatically. We're seeing more and more of the semi-automatics and automatic filling and capping machines on the market. Due to the higher viscosities of these cannabis extracts, filling requires to heat them. So depending on which machine you're using, that heat will come from the tip of the syringe, will come from an incubator and a pump that will inject that into the tip of the syringe, or one or the other, or even both. In some cases, that heating is done through UV lamps, which is not very detailed, and you can't really work on the consistency of that heating. But there are so many different ways of doing that. So every time you're heating an extract, you're changing its viscosity. Now, filling after heating is specifically made easier because you're basically lowering that viscosity and allowing the oil or the extract to flow a lot better around the components of the hardware. The second aspect is about the capping. So there's also another piece of the equation, if I could say so, which is the pressure. inside the device. Now, in some cases, we recommend capping them straight away. In other cases, we recommend waiting until that cools down to room temperature and then capping it, because there is off-gassing when you heat this, mostly because of the terpenes. In some cases, I mean, I've already seen cartridges that have more than 30% terpenes literally shatter because of the pressure, not even connected to a battery. I'm not talking about explosions, just shatter because they're sitting on the dashboard of a car for an entire day in Florida, for instance. So it's very important to understand that. Not to mention that the capillary action of the coils, that's the absorbent material and the wicking material that is going to absorb all of that extract and enable the aerosolization of that extract. The less viscous a concentrate is, the more it's going to get absorbed. That's why in some cases you got to cap it straight away, so there's pressure and it equalizes, so capillary action is a little bit slowed down. In some cases you don't want to slow it down because you want that wicking material to be full of that extract. The third aspect is storage. This is often something that's overlooked in the industry, but storage and actually logistics. In Canada, for instance, when the entire supply chain is the licensed producer, once they're filled, they sell it to a provincial board who then sells it to different dispensaries. Now imagine you're in the middle of the summer and you have one of these trucks taking the products from the licensed producer to the provincial board that is not thermoregulated. Well, you could have all of the products in there being heated up, sitting in the sun and being heated up at over 80 degrees in some cases. That will change completely the dynamic and the fluid mechanics, as well as the capillary action on each and every one of these products. The example I like to give, which is the previous one, is just leaving a cartridge on a dashboard. I can guarantee you, if you leave a cartridge on a dashboard in the heat all day, any cartridge, it is going to leak because it becomes very, very, very thin. And finally, usage. Now, this is the one everyone hopefully understands. When you have products and batteries that are able to heat these extracts at certain temperatures and repetitive pressure on these products, for instance, but prolonged use or frequent use, you can see in a social environment where you're literally, outside of COVID, of course, passing it on to friends or family that you're with. Every puff that is taken, that temperature, and depending on the material, will not completely cool down if you pass it on to someone else and that person takes a puff. Not only does that mean that the viscosity of the oil in the device will be different from one person to another, but it also potentially increases the toxicity of the emissions. Whereas the first person who used it, since it goes from, I would say, room temperature to 120 degrees, that second person who used it right after won't go from room temperature. They'll go from 100 degrees because it hasn't had time to cool down up to 180 or 200. And imagine that after 4 or 5 people, that coil has never had time to cool down. And the emissions and the heat is where you start seeing some toxic VOCs and degradants for each and every one of these products that Monica presented earlier, whether it's cannabinoids, terpenes, flavonoids. And I must insist, we don't have, as an industry, enough research on this. We do not know what the degradants of each and every terpene at each and every heat setting is. We need more research, and I think that's what Monica and I are really pushing everyone to do in the industry. Next slide, please. So thank you, Team RioSense. This is literally taken out of one of your fact sheets. This is the influence of temperature on viscosity. So as you can see, at 40 degrees or at 70 degrees C, the viscosity is completely different. Now, a good average in the industry, for instance, when filling a cartridge, You would bring this up to anywhere between 50 and 60 degrees C. So you're not burning, quote unquote, burning the terpenes, and you're still keeping that good flavor, but the oil is thin enough to be able to go all the way to the bottom of vaping devices. Temperature influences this a lot. So take that example I gave you previously on the dashboard. Imagine those devices and that cartridge sitting on a dashboard. I think we can all agree that in the sun, in a place like Florida or California or Texas, you would see that even go above 70 C. And you can see that ratio. You go from 8,000 back down to 200 in literally a couple of hours. That completely changes the dynamic and the use of that cannabis extract. Next slide, please. Here is another example when we are talking about temperatures and heating. This is a very detailed example. So if you have different voltages and you have a nichrome heating element in a ceramic coil at different types of ohmages, for a 5-second puff, these are the temperatures that you are going to be seeking. So depending on the formulation of your extract, that temperature and that sweet spot, I would say, where you're not burning the extract or you're not underusing it, where you're really only getting the flavor and not the high, will vary. That's why you need to really understand your oil. You need to understand the viscosities, and we can actually link this to the temperatures and the viscosities. Where I'm going with this is that we could have an entire predictive model once more research is done, of course. And keep in mind that this is after a 5-second puff. Most people in Canada, for instance, have an average of a 3.4 second puff. Sorry, in the US, we're looking at 4.8 second puff. So there is a big difference in the temperatures depending on the length of the puff. And of course, as stated previously, if you are passing this on or taking multiple puffs in a row, your coil has not had time to cool down, and your cannabis extract will be thinning up to a certain point where maybe your hardware can't handle it. Next slide, please. So I think really the bottom line and the conclusion to everything we've been discussing is that aerosolization is not simple. And as much as the physical, what happens physically is technically science, today we are at 75% science and 25% art. Again, because we just don't have enough research. Turning a cannabis oil into an aerosol is very complicated. It is a mathematical process. So that's the 75% part. The rest is really art. And when you're dealing about bioavailability, for instance, that Monica was speaking about earlier, if I use a device for maybe 5 seconds and every 30 seconds for a minute, and if she uses the exact same device for 5 seconds every 30 seconds, because our bioavailability is different, because our receptors are different, because we are physiologically completely different, we will not be able to guarantee the same results. And I think that's also one at least one of my pet peeves when people talk about dosing. Dosing doesn't really exist. Dosing is on the cartridge itself, for instance, or the disposable itself, and you say there's 1 milligram in there. It doesn't matter how many times you use it. When you're done, you know you've consumed 1 milligram. Not to mention that 1 milligram is probably not all going to get absorbed. Veering a little bit off topic here, but the major variables that we've just discussed are the influence of purity and composition of the cannabis extract on its viscosity. The second major variable is the influence of temperature on viscosity. And that temperature is not just theoretical. It's not just the temperature that we're looking at labs. It happens every single day. I'm here at the airport, for instance, in Montreal, and it's quite sunny outside. I can guarantee you that any device that I have right now will be roughly around 40 degrees C because it's sitting in the sun and has been for an hour. And finally, another variable is really the influence of environmental factors, like I just stated with the sun. With that said, I think we're done with the formal presentation, and there's so many things we can go into, but we'd be more than happy to answer any questions, or get back to you if we don't have any answers. Thank you, Rio Sense, for putting this on. And Monica, do you have any last words?
No, really, I appreciate the calling of the science. Definitely a lot more research is needed. Generating this data help not only the prediction of the performance, but around the byproducts that are coming out from the materials beyond cannabinoids, especially as we're going towards a more whole spectrum extracts type of approach. So those are my closing thoughts. Thank you.
I think maybe for the benefit of the audience, I don't know how cannabis everyone is when we're speaking about, for instance, the difference between distillate, live resin, live rosin, and whole plant extracts. When we're talking about whole plant extract, we're literally extracting everything from one plant and putting it together. When we're talking about distillate and adding in terpenes, those terpenes can be from the plant, but they can also be botanical terpenes or different kinds of terpenes or terpenes from other batches. You're basically recreating something. Whole plant extract is one extract. And then there's the mix as well of blends, where you would be using one same plant. You'd be extracting the cannabinoids on one side, extracting the terpenes on another, and then just reinserting some of those terpenes in there. So there's just so much variability. While I think, Monica, you and I would love a predictive model, we're still years from it.
Dude, and calling of data, but yeah, absolutely. It is moving quickly, but yeah, it is. There's a lot of lingo in the industry. Definitely. So there's a bit of uncovering there. So apologies if I thrown off with any of the industry lingo, but yeah, it really the key is the take home message is they're different dosage forms and they behave very differently and share different properties. So knowing those differences are critical to device selection when trying to optimize the product performance.
Thank you both so much for this excellent presentation and all of the interesting facts we've learned today and the science behind it. We really appreciate it. And we do have some questions that are coming in. So if anyone does have questions, please don't hesitate to drop them into the questions box. And I will go ahead and just start. And Arnaud and Monica, you can decide if you both want to answer or who would like to. But our first question is just, are there significant differences in the types of cart used? And I would imagine that's cartridges.
Yeah, there are a lot of differences. There's a lot of differences, not only in the shape, the form, but also in the materials that are used. There's the basic concept is an aerosol chamber through which the aerosol will move when the user is pulling, and a wicking system. That is common to most of the vaporizers, except maybe one or two that are very, very different. But the shape, the form factors are different. All of that influences the aerosol as well. Influences the size of the aerosol. For instance, porosity of ceramic. If you have a ceramic, which is the wicking material, that has a 30% porosity, the experience will be completely different than if it has 60% viscosity, porosity. Not to mention that when you're going to be looking into the temperatures are going to vary. Same thing with the types of materials. Now, the main and most common type of material that you see on the market, mostly for cheap products on Alibaba or DHgate, is an alloy called H59. That brass alloy does contain 2.65% lead, and that lead will leach into the extract, and it will leach even more when people use it more. The leaching to that effect happens because of the temperature, which is the main factor, but also because of the pH. pH, I would say a standard pH for a cannabis extract is around 4. But if you're looking at live resin, more terpenes, more acidity, you're going to bring it down to 3. If you're looking at really just distillate, you can get up to 4, 5. So there are a lot of factors, and every little change in a piece of hardware, even people adding logos, for instance, on that center post in the oil, can be very dangerous, depending on the material that's used, because there can always be some sort of residue of any elemental metal in there. I hope that answered the question.
I think it did. The next question is, can you discuss the difference between C-cell and wick type of products?
There is a wicking material in every single device. C-cell has patented a specific porosity of ceramic with a specific shape of heating elements. There are other materials that can be used. There can be other types of ceramics, other types of porosities, but the ceramic used in C-cell is wicking material. There is no vaporization or aerosol generation without a wicking material, unless you're using desktop vaporizers with induction, for instance. But on all the portable ones, there is wicking material. So it's all about nomenclature. When you say wick, people think of a candle and think of a cotton wick. But that's not true, because essentially in a C-cell, in a Blinc cartridge, the quartz ceramic or the ceramic, they are all wicking materials.
Wonderful. And then someone asked, what's the temperature needed to be measured for viscosity?
So typically you have to think about under what conditions you'll be working on at. And so also Arnaud had mentioned different locations and considerations, but also during the process step, and trying to understand those temperature ranges. Typically when I do an assessment, I do several temperature ranges because I want to get a sense of that ramp up. If there's a sweet spot, or if they're, at certain temperature, it starts behaving quite differently. So that's doing like a full screening and the characterization part of it. Generally looking, I want to capture the process as well as the vaping experience. So depending on who's asking, if you're a manufacturer, if you're a cannabis brand, you'll want to hone in on those temperatures in a little bit more detail.
And on that note, shout out to you guys from Rio Sense, because some of the products that you're providing specifically allow us to do that with a lot less oil than some traditional viscometer products. So we're looking forward to using these products moving forward.
We're very excited for the data you'll be able to collect from that. Someone asked, does elevation of the product used also have an impact?
Pressure does have an impact, because when you say elevation, there is pressure. So I'll give you a very simple example. When we're testing some pieces of hardware, we send some to some of our friends in Colorado in the ski resorts, because we want to understand what that difference is. Also, pressure will have a big impact on the capillary action of the wicking material, because more pressure there is, more of that oil is going to be pushed into the wicking material and potentially leakage. That's why it's not recommended to fly with any device. If you take a long haul flight to Asia with even a CBD cartridge, I can guarantee you it is going to leak if you don't put it upside down, because capillary action, again, is dependent on pressure. So yes, elevation has a pretty big impact, especially when we're looking at some of these less viscous new types of vaping concentrates like live resin and live rosin.
So speaking of live resin, someone's asked, do you see viscosity differences between distillates, live resin, and blends?
Absolutely, 100%. So if you go back to the previous slides, I showed even just within the purity differences of one cannabinoid, we're seeing huge changes in the viscosity. Yeah, if you go back a few more slides, there we go. And this is, all of this data was obtained from distillate. So the complexity when you go into, and so distillate being a broad spectrum, higher purity. So if you go more into the live resins, the rosins of full spectrum profiles, that adds to the complexity as well with those differences. So it's the art, as Arnaud had mentioned, of understanding the cannabinoid profile of the live resin, and getting an assessment and a better prediction of how it would perform in the vape pen based on those cannabinoid differences. Like, for example, CBD and THC, while they are very structurally similar, CBD has an open ring, and as a result, it makes it more of a mobile compound, which results in its lower viscosity. So just understanding a little bit of the science, your certificate of analysis, going through the details, not just looking at, okay, what's my THC value, really digging in deeper, that will help better predict and select that performance.
And then another question was, do you have any thoughts about the vitamin A issue with the vapes?
Monica, do you want to start?
Either vitamin A or vitamin E acetate, as has gotten the headlines. But in general, regardless of A or E, there shouldn't be inhaling vitamins. These were used as a diluent, as I had mentioned, to reduce the viscosity and maybe cut some costs down. This is primarily in the illegal market being performed, but regardless of vitamin E acetate or other vitamins, and even medium chain triglycerides, MCT oils, those are not, while readily safe to ingest, the formation, the components of this oily substance and should just not be heated and inhaled. So this is where we have to really be mindful of what we are, introducing to people's lungs, with the added consideration that by what you're putting in and testing as a C of A is completely different as what is coming out. As Arnaud had mentioned, the transition going from a concentrate to an aerosol is a lot of chemistry, heat, and formation of byproducts. So that transition is where we're, we as an industry in whole need to evaluate some more. But yeah, that is definitely unfortunate. But considering, a good reminder that we have a very high bioavailability through the lungs, so we need to be extremely careful as what's going into these products that people will eventually be exposed to.
Yeah, just furthermore, and literally just using common sense, we have a lot of products and a lot of ingredients that are approved for ingestion. Why are they approved for ingestion? Because we have enzymes that'll break those products down. Other products are approved for cutaneous use. Why? Because you have all those levels of derm that will break the products down and filter out what your body can't handle. You don't have any of those in your lungs. So why would you even want to put products like extra vitamins, or even if they're preservatives, vitamin E acetate, tocopherol, that's all products that are used in cosmetics. Great, but you have your skin to protect you. Your lungs do not have those layers of protection. So it's again, a common sense approach. Now, one caveat to that is that there are food grade certifications there are cutaneous use certifications. There aren't today any vapology grade certifications, and that's really what we're trying to do. For instance, in Europe, with the European standards, is create vapology grade products that we know will be safe. But again, the master theme here is we need more research, and the industry needs to be doing more research.
And in kind of speaking of, we've talked about vaporization. Do you measure extensional viscosity when using cannabis turning into aerosols?
You measure viscosity.
Extensional viscosity.
No, we haven't taken it to that extent with that. And like I said, that transition requires the analytics that I just haven't had exposure to. And it's also very hard to assess. Now, in the nicotine space, I've done a little bit of research around that. Just the availability to some of these characterization tools was a lot more open than we have here in cannabis. But yeah, that's a good point. But no, that's not something that has been had the tools and access to investigate yet.
And then it looks like the last question is, and I can maybe turn this over to my team also, but are you able to steer me into data on viscosity of terpenes as a function of temperature? Is there any published data that you maybe have access to?
If they're looking for pure neat terpenes, I think a lot of those terpene suppliers would support them. In terms of just the viscosity data, no. Not that I can think on the top of my head, but that's a good question. I could get back to you on that. But I would definitely, those suppliers of the terpene should have that on hand.
Perfect. Well, I want to again thank you both so much for the presentation and for the Q&A, and just such a breadth of knowledge of all things cannabis as far as hardware and the formulation as well. And again, we will be sending out the recording. So if anyone does have questions or does want to connect, I will leave the slide that's up now up for just a few moments, so you're able to connect with Arnaud and Monica. And we will be taking our 10-minute break before we have our final speaker. Before we take that break, I just want to say thank you one last time to Via Innovations and the Blinc Group for such a wonderful presentation this afternoon.